Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Welcome to part 3 of my look through the ages at the Dungeons & Dragons Bard. Today's video we're going to be talking about the Bard class in D&D 4th edition. Originally my plan was to cover both 4th and 5th edition in the same video, but I think I'm actually going to keep 5e as its own separate video. I still will also be covering the Pathfinder 2nd edition Bard as well as a Starfinder class that is heavily inspired by the Bard, although that might appear in the companion video, which I'm going to do at the end of the series, where I look at some alternate class features and some archetypes for the Bard class throughout various editions, with predominantly 3rd edition, Pathfinder 1st edition, 4th edition D&D, and even a little bit of 5th edition stuff. I decided to stick with just one edition in this video because the design for 4e is quite a bit different than the game design of 3rd edition or even 5th edition, which kind of stepped back a little bit to be more closer to the 3rd edition style, even though it still shares a lot in common with 4th edition, but that's a video of a whole other subject for another day. But there are some aspects of 4e that I kind of want to discuss or try to explain before getting into the specific class, because I think there are just some things that you kind of need to understand, or that I should at least put out there so it makes some of the explanations a little bit easier for the Bard class overall. What I have here is the 4th edition Player's Handbook. Now, the Bard class doesn't actually appear in this book, but this is the book where it will give us some of the information that we need to sort of set the stage for when the Bard class was released. So one of the core things with 4th edition is that it more heavily focused character class design around the combat system, but not just the combat system, but about filling specific roles within combat. The classes, particularly in the first player's handbook, which is what we have here, were very heavily focused on a single role in combat, whereas characters from subsequent player's handbooks, because there were 3 of them total for 4th edition D&D, they sort of split things up a little bit and allowed classes to fill, multiple roles instead of focusing more heavily on just the one. Now, 4th edition, a lot of people say it's the version of D&D that abandoned role-playing in exchange for pure combat, and that's really not the case. I've never really liked that sort of statement, because it's just not true. I mean, I've run, I should say, 4th edition games where people role-played more in 4e than they did in my 2nd edition AD&D games that I would run back in the day, or even some of my 3rd edition games. So a group is always going to role-play as much or as little as they are comfortable with, and it doesn't really matter what the rule set is for that. Role-playing in 4th edition is still just as fun as it can be in any other edition. They just tried to design the rules around a combat system that is the driving force behind basically every edition of D&D. I mean, the game itself was derived from tabletop strategy games, battle recreation games, so to say that combat was, never the main focus of the Dungeons & Dragons game is a bit misleading. Even in earlier editions in AD&D, for example, or Basic Expert, where you gained more experience for finding treasure than you did for killing enemies, generally speaking, you still had to kill enemies to get to the point where you could find that treasure. So it's just always been a big part of the game. But here, it was sort of the core concept around which the game was developed. And that even goes into some of the role-playing aspects when you look at things like skill challenges, which is essentially a way of sort of coming up with creative ways to use your skills in more like social type of situations, and try to come up with a mechanic that can make it easier for people that just aren't as comfortable with role-playing, still being able to contribute to something like negotiations or in trying to gain information from prisoners, or just anything along those lines. Anyway, this video is really meant to be my defense of 4th edition, which I've already done before, but I just kind of want to lay some of that stuff out there because it's some of the common things I've heard about 4e, and to be fair, I don't think it's really accurate. It's just something that's always been a big part of the game. It's just, like I said, now it's a bit more of a focus when it comes to character design. And honestly, I think that's kind of for the better, but we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So one of the things that I had mentioned was the different roles that characters can play in a combat situation. So let's just take a look at the actual roles that we have here. So we've got character roles. So each character class specializes in one of the 4 basic functions of combat. Now, this is something that, again, later versions of, or later editions of Player's Handbooks, like the Player's Handbook 2, Player's Handbook 3, and even like the D&D Essential started to have sort of more, instead of focusing specifically on one, there's a major and a minor focus. But for the 4 basic functions of combat, you have control and area offense, defense, healing, and support. The functions are controller, defender, leader, and striker. So let's just take a look at what they have as definitions for each of these. So we've got controller. So controller, the class example that they give here is the wizard. And let's just actually zoom in a little bit tighter on this here. So the controller wizard. Controllers deal with large numbers of enemies at the same time. So it's not necessarily about like mental control so much as it is controlling the battlefield. Like I said, you can attack large numbers of creatures. You can create effects that can hinder enemy movements or impose penalties on enemies, things along those lines. So it says here that the controller favors offense over defense, using powers that deal damage to multiple foes at once, as well as subtler powers that weaken, confuse, or delay their foes. So that one's going to be important because it's going to actually factor directly into our subject of today's video. The next one that we have here are defenders. So these are like the fighter and paladin are examples that they give here. Defenders have the highest defenses in the game and good close-up offense. They are the party's frontline combatants. Wherever they're standing, that's where the action is. Defenders have abilities and powers that make it difficult for enemies to move past them or to ignore them in battle. So these are kind of your tanks. These are the ones that will sort of try to absorb as many attacks as possible and try to have a high enough defense that it will frustrate and make it difficult for enemies to hit. But they also have abilities that, again, can make it difficult for enemies to target other individuals. One of the things that a lot of the defender classes sort of have several abilities that revolve around is the ability to mark a target. And it's a game mechanic that if you mark an enemy, the enemy suffers penalties on attack rolls unless you are included in the attack. So if an enemy has an area of effect and you have them marked and they target a group of, player characters or allies that doesn't include you, their attack roll against that entire group suffers a penalty. However, if you're included in that group, like say a fireball or something like that, then they no longer suffer that penalty. So it's one of those things that once a target is marked, they're also aware that they're marked. They know who it is that marked them. So it's not something where it's going to be like a mystery or they're, not going to be aware of what's going on. It's a situation where they then have to decide if they want to absorb the penalty to target something else, or if they're going to focus on the creature that marked them to remove that penalty from them. So that's sort of one of the major things that defenders have on top of their really good defense and their abilities to do things like prevent movement or to, shift enemies towards them or things like that. Then the next one that we have is the leader. This is also one that's going to factor in heavily to today's video. So the leader is, the examples I give here are cleric or warlord. Again, these are from the classes presented in this book. So leaders inspire, heal, and aid the other characters in the adventuring group. Leaders have good defenses, but their strength lies in powers that protect their companions and target specific foes for the party to concentrate on. So again, an example of that could be an ability where if you hit a target, then allies who also attack that target before the start or the end of your next turn could get bonuses to hit, or the target may suffer a penalty on one of their defenses until a certain period, so it makes them more attractive targets for your party members to attack. That sort of thing goes to the leader, and they also have a lot of like healing abilities. Then the last one that we have here are strikers, and they're considered to be like rangers, rogues, or warlocks. And strikers specialize in dealing high amounts of damage to a single target at a time. So these are basically your To use a video game term, these are kind of like your DPS, but they are more or less designed to take on like one-on-one style of combat. So where controllers can attack large groups, and defenders can make it difficult for enemies to attack others or, maneuver around the battlefield. Leaders can boost their allies as well as have abilities that can allow their allies to attack more efficiently or have their opponents be somewhat weakened. And then strikers, like I said, they are the ones that are more focused on single combat, and which they're really good at. So there's sort of the different roles that they give to the different types of characters. Like I said, the Player's Handbook 1 was really heavily focused on having each class be really good at one of these roles in particular, and that's what sort of informed the way that they designed the class. But once we get to the Player's Handbook 2, which we're going to very shortly here, you'll see that sort of changes, and they'll have a primary role that they fill, which determines a lot of their abilities, but they'll also have a secondary ability that they can also rely on. Another thing about D&D 4th edition is each of the classes has their primary attribute, which is something that classes have always had, but in this version of the game, generally speaking, a class's attack options will use their primary attribute. So for example, fighters will rely on either strength or dexterity, wizards will rely a lot on their intelligence, clerics will rely a lot on their wisdom, rogues on their dex, things along those lines. And classes like the bard, as you'll see, will rely heavily on using their charisma. So it's designed so that when you make your attacks, you're always attacking with one of your best attributes, as opposed to in previous editions, like in 3rd edition, where if you had a wizard who was making a melee spell attack, they would be rolling using their really weak base attack bonus and their strength modifier, which was usually one of their worst stats, and oftentimes could end up even being a penalty, but that's what they had to use because that's the way that the game was structured. In this version, you generally attack with your class's primary ability. So it's just one of those things that, again, makes the classes, the characters, able to be more functional when it comes to combat. Because, again, if you look at the Bard in, say, 3rd edition, they had an okay attack bonus, but again, their primary attributes that you would be looking at for the Bard in 3rd edition would be their mental stats. Charisma, obviously, is their most important one because that's their spell casting, but because most of the skills in the D&D game revolve around charisma, wisdom, and intelligence, those were going to be 3 of your highest numbers. The other attribute that gets used somewhat decently for skills would be your dexterity, but you also had bards being able to attack with things like longswords where they had to use their strength. So it was just another situation where they just weren't as capable as they probably should be or could be, and often it felt like it's almost a waste to make the attack rolls because your stats are just not good enough for you to really, reliably be useful. So that's something else that they changed. Another major thing, 2 more major things to kind of focus on here, is the fact that in 4th edition, characters no longer have hit dice, and their abilities that they gain as they go through levels, the level of the ability is the same as the character level they have to be at in order to gain that ability in the first place. So a famous example would be Fireball, which was a 3rd level wizard spell, which wizards had to be 5th level in order to get. So they had to be 5th level in order to gain a 3rd level spell. In 4th edition, Fireball is a 5th level wizard ability, which is functionally basically the same thing as a 3rd level spell slot, but they just did away with that, and it's just now a 5th level ability because they can't get it until they reach 5th. And again, that's something that I also kind of like, because it meant that level no longer had to mean like 3 different things in the context of a single game. Level could now just essentially be just one thing. The level that you're at is the level that you gain the ability at, and it's considered to be that level of ability. For me, again, I think that was just a better way to go about it. And the last thing is the way that they deal with saving throws or defenses. So in 3rd edition, you had Fortitude, Reflex, and Will saving throws, and generally speaking, a lot of the times you would have player characters forcing large groups of enemies to make a saving throw, again using fortitude, reflex, or will. Think about things like spells or some other abilities that characters might use that will force a saving throw. It's just something that caused the DM to roll a lot of extra rolls and could sometimes kind of grind things down to a bit of a halt. Now in 4th edition, you don't have the saving throws anymore. They're considered to be a type of defense. So you have your armor class defense, which is usually used against physical weapon attacks. You now have fortitude, which is designed to protect you against things that target your body, like not weapons, but things such as poison or disease. You have the reflex defense, which is your ability to dodge certain things. So instead of a fireball causing the DM to roll a saving throw, you now just make an attack roll with the fireball, and if it's equal to or higher than your reflex defense, then the attack hits. If not, it misses. And then you have will defense, and that's things that target the mind, such as charm and things along those lines. But they're considered defenses now instead of being saving throws. So again, it cuts down generally on the rolling that is made. So that's one really good thing about it. Also, you don't gain a large number. You don't get. I think I mentioned hit dice, but I feel like I went off on a little bit of a tangent on that one. So you no longer have hit dice as you progress through levels. What you instead gain is a fixed number of hit points at first level. It's usually a pretty big number. So I think the Bard starts with 12 hit points at first level, plus you add your Constitution score, not the modifier, but you just add the score, and then at every level you just gain a fixed number of hit points, and that's that. So instead of gaining 1d6 plus your con modifier as you level, you start with 12 plus your con. So let's just say you had a 10 con for your Bard. You would have 12 for your class, 10 for your Constitution score, and then when you gain your next level, I think you gain 5 hit points each level after that. So just, again, it's a fixed number. 5th edition kind of works the same way if you're using the fixed totals, except you get to add your con modifier every level instead of having a larger number of hit points to start with, plus your overall Constitution score. So with that, I think we're pretty much ready to actually take a look at the Bard class. So the Bard class debuted for 4th edition inside of the Player's Handbook 2. And again, this is the reason why I wanted this video to be just about the core 4th edition Bard, because there was a lot of stuff that I felt like was important to explain about 4e before we get into the class itself. So the Player's Handbook 2 introduced some of the classes that were absent from the Player's Handbook 1 that people were kind of familiar with after 3rd edition. So this had your Barbarian, your Bard, your Druid, as well as your Sorcerer, I believe is in here, as well as some new unique classes, because 4th edition actually had a ton of core classes, but we're not interested in those here today. We are looking specifically at the Bards. So we are going to turn to page 66 in the Player's Handbook 2. And here we have our Bard class. So we've got our class traits here. So here is the role. So like I said before, you had classes in the first Player's Handbook that were designed with one specific role in mind. The characters in the Player's Handbook 2 were a little bit more well-rounded, or at least they spelled it out a lot clearer for you. So the role of the Bard is a leader, meaning that they have things that can heal as well as increase their allies' abilities in combat, like attack bonuses, or they can make it easier to target certain creatures by lowering their defenses, things like that. So it says your spells inspire and invigorate your allies. Your spells also include significant number of control elements, making controller a natural secondary role. So they have things that can heal and boost allies, and they also have abilities that can target multiple enemies, as well as provide minor penalties or effects that hinder your foes. Their key abilities are Charisma, Intelligence, and Constitution. And their armor proficiencies, they're proficient in cloth, leather, hide, chainmail armor, as well as light shields. So I think we actually get the shields back. I believe the 3.5 Bard was not proficient in shields, if I recall correctly. Also, in this version of the game, these are specific armor types, but they also are kind of a category, so they may have other types of armors in there. For example, leather can include your basic leather armor, but there was a book later that reintroduced studded leather armor, and it was part of the leather family of armors. So that's the way that that's sort of handled. They're proficient in simple melee weapons as well as the longsword, scimitar, short sword. They're also proficient in all simple range weapons as well as military range weapons. So they have greater proficiencies in ranged weaponry than they do necessarily in melee weaponry, which is good because they kind of want to stay out of the main fighting. You know, again, they're more of a secondary role as far as that's concerned. So yeah, they actually gave them a bit more of a focus on range attacks here. Also, 4th edition includes what's called implements. So for spellcasters in particular, they channel their energies through an implement. So like they could be like staffs, wands, or orbs for characters like sorcerers and wizards. For bards, they can channel it through certain weapons as well as certain instruments. So that's sort of what they can use, and they can use wand implements. Implements also were designed mechanically so they could mimic a magical weapon. So where a fighter might get a +1 longsword that gives them +1 to hit and to damage, you know, a spellcaster could get a magical implement, which also conveys a +1 bonus to hit and damage rolls. So they made it so that it could function similarly. They also get defense bonuses. They get +1 to their reflex defense as well as their will defense. They get 12 hit points plus their constitution score at first level, which I mentioned. They also gain 5 hit points for every level after first. Also keep in mind, 4th edition is designed for characters to go from 1st all the way up to 30th level, as opposed to 20th like 3rd edition and 4th edition. They also get a whole bunch of skills that they can choose from that could be trained in. They're automatically trained in Arcana, plus they get to choose 4 more skills from the list provided below. I'm not going to read them all. But again, they get some decent stuff when it comes to skills. And then we got their basic class features here, which we're going to look at a little bit more closely. When it comes to the rest of their like level dependent abilities, we're not going to look at every single one. We're just going to look at a few that kind of stand out or catch my attention as I'm flipping through, but we will heavily focus on their first level stuff so you can get an idea of how their class features and abilities are kind of structured. So let's take a look here. The first level stuff that we have Bardic Training. So you gain Ritual Caster feat as a bonus feat, allowing you to use magical rituals. So rituals are a type of spell that don't require there's no spell slots, but they don't have like at will, daily, or encounter type of powers. They're things that you do outside of combat that take a while to cast. But you can do them essentially as many times as you want. You just need the time frame to do it in. You usually have to have like a ritual book for something like that. But yeah, so you're able to cast rituals here. And you start with a ritual book that contains 2 rituals of your choice that you have mastered, 1 first level ritual that has Bard as a prerequisite, and another first level ritual. So they get a little bit of flexibility where they can choose something from another class. If it doesn't have like the Bard as the prerequisite for like that secondary one. In addition, you can perform 1 Bard ritual per day of your level or lower without expending components. So material components sort of had a bit more of a significant role in 4th edition, particularly when it came to the rituals, because some of them would have like gold piece component costs and stuff like that. So really, really cool there. And then they can do that an additional time per day without expending resources at 11th level. And they can do it 3 times per day once they reach 21st. Classes are designed in such a way that there are 3 tiers that they go through. There is the heroic tier, which is levels 1 through 10. There's kind of like the bread and butter of most D&D games. Adventures are more regionally focused, more locally focused, I should say, when it comes to the heroic tier. Then from levels 11 to 20, you are in your what's called the Paragon tier, and that's where your actions can actually affect entire nations. So it kind of scales up that way. And then finally, from levels 21 to 30, you're in the epic tier, where the fabric of reality could potentially hang in the balance based on, you know, the types of adventures that are designed for that level tier. So that's just sort of the way that it works. So there's tier 1, 2, and 3. Then we have our Bardic Virtue. So bards praise many virtues in their stories, telling tales of people whose particular qualities set them above the common folk. The valor of dauntless heroes and cunning of great minds are among these virtues, and a bard can choose to emphasize either quality. So you choose one of the following options. The choice you make gives you the benefit described below, but also there are several Bard abilities that you can gain, like your at-will encounter and daily abilities that might have a secondary effect depending on which virtue that you choose. So the first one here is Virtue of Cunning. So once per round, when an enemy attack misses an ally within a number of squares equal to 5 plus your intelligence modifier, you can slide that ally 1 square as a free action. So that's sort of, again, sort of like the leader thing where you can, position or sort of reposition your allies. I know that 4th edition, again, people talk about it requires miniatures in order to run because everything's in squares. But squares are, the same way that they are in 3rd edition or the same way that they would be in 4th edition. Each square represents 5 feet. So you could just say, 25 feet plus 5 feet, for each point of like intelligence modifier, for example. So if you had a +2 intelligence modifier, it would be 35 feet. So it's really easy to convert. It's not that big of a deal. So again, you don't actually need a grid for 4th edition. But yeah, so that's the Virtue of Cunning, and then Virtue of Valor. So once per round, when an ally within 5 squares of you reduces an enemy to 0 hit points, or bloodies an enemy, which is when they're reduced to half of their hit point maximum, you can grant temporary hit points to that ally as a free action. The number of temporary hit points equals 1 plus your Constitution modifier at 1st level, 3 plus your Con modifier at 11th level, and 5 plus your Con modifier at 21st level. And again, that's per round, so that's something you could do multiple times in a combat or per day, but only once per round. They also get the Majestic Word ability, which we'll take a look at in a moment. They also gain multi-class versatility. So I'm not going to go too much into multi-classing in this video, but in 4th edition, you basically, when you take multi-classing, it's not taking a level of another class, it's a feat that you choose, which will give you minor access to certain class features, and then there are multi-classing feats within that that require that first, I don't want to say dedication, because I think I'm confusing that with another system. But there's like the basic feat, and then there are other ones that you can take that allow you to gain more and more powerful abilities from the class. Personally, I prefer it over the way multi-classing was done in 3rd and 4th edition, but essentially the Bard is just can multi-class more freely and easily than other ones. I want to say in 4th you're limited to just one multi-class option, but this one allows you to do that from more than one class, so you actually get to, again, dip into several other classes instead of just the one. You also get skill versatility, so you gain a +1 bonus to all untrained skill checks. So this kind of goes along with the heavily skill-focused jack of all trades kind of thing. So even if you don't choose to be trained in a particular skill, you still get at least a minor bonus into it, which is great. You get Song of Rest. So when you play an instrument or sing during a short rest, you and each ally you can hear are affected by your Song of Rest. The affected creature when an affected creature spends healing surges at the end of the rest, that character regains additional hit points equal to your charisma modifier with each healing surge that they use. Healing surges are similar to hit dice, sort of, what we have in 5th edition, but what they are is they're effectively a quarter of your hit points. So you have your maximum hit points, and then half of your maximum hit points rounded down is considered to be your bloodied value. And then half of your bloodied value rounded down is what your healing surge value is. So usually it shouldn't take any more than 4 to get pretty much to max. And when you spend a healing surge, I think you add your con modifier. I could be wrong on that. I think maybe you just gain the hit points back. But with this one, you gain the hit points back plus the Bard's charisma modifier, which is usually pretty good because that's their primary attribute. They also gain the ability Words of Friendship, which we'll see here in a moment, and then it just talks about their implements, which are wands, but they can also use what are called song blades, as well as certain instruments, and again, they can just function similarly to a magical weapon. So let's just take a look at the class powers, and again, we're going to focus primarily on just the first level stuff here, and then we'll flip through and take a look at some of the other abilities that might stick out to me as I'm flipping through, but we're not going to go through 30 levels worth of new powers, although you don't gain new powers at each and every single level. It comes kind of close. So let's just take a look, first of all, at the Majestic Word ability, which is one that you get as a Bard right away. It is an encounter power, so it means that you can only use it technically once per encounter, although this has a special ability where you can use it twice per encounter, but only once in a single round. But it's a healing action, and it is a close burst 5. So for that range, it's essentially a 25-foot radius that's centered on you as the spellcaster, and then it gets larger as you progress to the Paragon tier and the Epic tier. The target is you or one ally in the burst, so it's not everybody because it's, again, a starting class feature. It's just you create this area, and then anyone in that area can choose a single person. And then what it says here is the target that you choose can spend a healing surge and regain additional hit points equal to your charisma modifier, and you slide the target 1 square. So it's a weaker version of their Song of Rest because they can only spend a single surge, but again, it's a minor action, meaning that you can still do like a normal attack on top of it. So it's actually a pretty decent ability overall. And one of the big things I should also mention about 4th edition is a lot of healing, like magic or healing spells or abilities, actually rely on the target's healing surges as opposed to just dealing or healing a fixed amount of hit points. There are still some abilities that will do that, but a lot of things essentially accelerate the body's natural healing. And I actually kind of like that because it more closely ties into how healing is represented a lot of times in like D&D novels or other like fantasy, sort of media where you have a healer that basically says, I'm sorry, they're too far gone. Their injuries are too great for my magic to overcome. And with 4th edition, it actually kind of works that way. So if you run out of healing surges, then, it's basically much more difficult for you to receive healing, which makes combat more dangerous if you don't get plenty of regular rests in. So again, I kind of like that. And then as you progress through different levels, you gain extra like D6s that you can add to that as well. Then we got Words of Friendship. So this is a minor action as well. And it's a personal, so it can only target you, but the effect is you gain a +5 power bonus to your next diplomacy check that you make before the end of your next turn. And it says here, you infuse your words with arcane power, transforming even the simplest speech into compelling oratory. Then we're going to look at their at-will abilities. So these are essentially powers or class features that they can use an unlimited number of times per day. If the 5th edition equivalent might be things like 0-level spells or cantrips, I guess is what they're called now. So it's kind of similar along these. But these are sort of their primary types of attacks that they can make. They also have things like a basic melee or a basic range attack that they can do as well. Things like opportunity attacks will use the basic melee versus being able to use these at-will abilities, which are done on your turn and can't be done as part of a reaction. But let's just take a look here. We got Guiding Strike. So your weapon stroke guides your ally, showing them where to focus their attacks. It's an at-will ability, and again, they're also color-coded, which makes organization so much easier. At-will is green, encounter powers are red, and then your daily powers are basically like in gray. So again, organizationally, I love 4th edition. So it's an at-will arcane weapon attack. It's a standard action. It requires a melee weapon. It targets one creature, and the attack is your normal attack bonus, but you use your charisma instead of, like strength or whatever. So again, you tend to use your primary class attribute for your attack. So it's charisma versus armor class, and if you hit, you deal 1 weapon die of damage, or like the normal weapon dice damage that is determined by the equipment charts. In this game, like 2-handed weapons deal like a D10, I think, for a greatsword and a D12 for a great axe. So there's no like 2D6. But as you, again, once you reach like 21st level, once you go into epics, most of your at-will abilities, especially weapon-dependent attacks, will deal twice the weapon dice instead of just the 1. Anyway, so it's 1 weapon die plus charisma modifier damage, and the target takes a -2 penalty to the defense of your choice until the end of your next turn. So that's some of like the controller aspect of the class there. At 21st level, like I said, it's just 2 weapon plus charisma modifier, and you still get to do the other stuff. Then we have Misdirected Mark. So you conceal your arcane attack, tricking your foe into thinking the attack came from one of your allies. It's an at-will again, Arcane Implement. It's a standard action, and it has a range of 10 squares or 50 feet. The target is one creature, and it is Charisma versus Reflex. If you hit, it's 1d8 plus Charisma modifier damage, and the target is marked by an ally within 5 squares of you until the end of your next turn. And at 21st level, again, it just deals an extra d8 damage. So again, marking, that imposes a penalty on the person who's marked. If they don't attack or make an attack that includes the person who marked them in the attack. In this case, you're not actually marking the target yourself. You're marking it kind of on behalf of another character. So this situation, the easiest way to sort of explain this is if your wizard is being attacked and by an enemy, you could use Misdirected Mark and have the mark be placed on it. So you mark the enemy, and the person that's marking them, you direct them towards the group's fighter or paladin, which are meant to sort of draw attacks towards them anyway. And again, once you're marked, you know who marked you. In this case, it would be the person that you choose to mark the target. But it's just a way, again, of forcing the enemies to consider whether they want to suffer a penalty on their attacks or if they want to go over after the person that marked them. So I love the fact that you can actually place that on behalf of someone. I will say this one could sort of create a potential for being a bit of a jerk in the game, but try to do it in such a way that your group is totally okay with it. Then we got Vicious Mockery. So this is actually an ability that became a Bard cantrip, I think, in 5th edition. So you unleash a string of insults at your foe, weaving them with Bardic music or Bardic magic to send the creature into a blind rage. This is an at-will arcane charm, implement, and psychic. So implement means that if you have you require an implement to cast to use the ability. But again, if you have like a magical implement that gives you a bonus to attack and damage, you get to add that to abilities with the implement keyword. Standard action, range is 10 squares, so again 50 feet. Target one creature, and the attack is Charisma versus their will defense. And it's 1d6 plus your Charisma modifier, psychic damage, and the target takes a -2 penalty to attack rolls until the end of your next turn. At 21st level, it's 2d6 plus Charisma plus the other effects. And then we've got War Song Strike. So it says you sing a song of war and victory, invigorating your allies as they press the attack. It is an at-will arcane weapon ability. It's a standard action and requires a melee weapon. Target one creature, Charisma versus armor class. And if you hit, it's the weapon die plus your Charisma modifier, and any ally who hits the target before the end of your next turn gains temporary hit points equal to your Constitution modifier. That's why Constitution was listed as their 3rd most important attribute for the class. And at level 21, it's just 2 weapon dice plus Charisma modifier plus the other stuff. So those are their at-will abilities. And as you can see already, the Bard is much more effective at combat than they were in like 3rd edition as well as 2nd edition. So already we're kind of seeing that. And you can see that, again, their abilities, all of them so far have had a feature which either bolsters an ally or hinders an enemy. So there's a lot of things that you can sort of do with those abilities. So I really like that aspect of it. All right, so we're going to take a look now at we'll zoom in a little bit. We're going to take a look at their encounter spells, and you don't gain all of these. These are, essentially options that you can choose from. So I think you start with 2 at wills, and you gain one encounter and 1 daily at 1st level, but these are just the options that you have. So level 1 encounter spells. Blunder. You fog your foe's mind, causing it to stumble past your allies. This is an arcane charm and implement ability. It's a standard action, and it has a range of 5 squares or 25 feet. Target is one creature. Attack is Charisma versus will. And the effect is 1d6 plus Charisma modifier damage, and you slide the target 2 squares. During the slide, you or one of your allies can make a melee basic attack against the target as a free action with a +2 bonus on the attack roll. So here you can kind of see again where the encounter powers are slightly more powerful, but I wouldn't necessarily call them game breaking. Just you slide them and you can essentially choose yourself or one other person to get that free strike. So, and that free strike would be again specified as a basic attack. They would be able to use one of their own at-will abilities. It would have to be just the basic melee strike, but it's still a really cool ability. And this one also has an extra feature if you have the Virtue of Cunning, and it says the power bonus to the attack roll equals 1 plus your intelligence modifier. So if you are a college, or if you're a valorous bard, for example, then it's, +2, just a flat bonus. But if you are a cunning bard, then it's 1 plus your intelligence modifier, which, could be a +3, +4, or what have you. So, and that will continue to go up, obviously, as you increase your ability score. So really, really cool stuff there. Then we have Fast Friends. So it's a level 1 bard attack. You sing a tune of false friendship, leaving your foe in revere. Encounter, Arcane, Charm, Implement, Standard Action, range 25 feet. Target one creature, attack, Charisma versus Will. Choose yourself or an ally. The target cannot attack that character until the end of your next turn, or until you or one of your allies attacks the target. So again, that's more of the control aspect, hindering an enemy. Inspiring Refrain. Your weapon hums with an arcane song that helps guide nearby allies to glory. It's an encounter ability, arcane weapon, standard action, melee weapon, target one creature, attack, charisma versus armor class. If you hit, it is 2 weapon dice because again, encounter powers are more powerful than the at will, but the downside is that you can only use them once per combat encounter. So 2 weapon dice plus your charisma modifier to damage, and each ally within 5 squares of you, or 25 feet, gains a +1 power bonus to attack rolls until the end of your next turn. Then the last one that we have here is Song of Triumph. So this is the last level 1 encounter power that we have. It says you unleash a mighty call of battle, scattering your enemies while urging your allies forward. Encounter, Arcane, Implement, and Thunder. Standard action, Close Blast 3. So Close Blast is kind of like, think of it like a cone. So something like Burning Hands would be an example of a close blast, meaning that it goes out in like a 3 square, it goes like 3 squares, or in this case, it'd be like 15 feet. In any direction from an origin point, but you have to be, the caster has to be adjacent to one of the squares as like that origin point. So kind of like I said, think of it like Burning Hands essentially. It attacks each enemy in the blast. You just make the 1 attack roll, and if it hits, it hits. If it misses, it misses. And you would just attack, or you would compare your attack result against the, in this case, it would be the fortitude defense of everybody in the area. Also, keep in mind that it does say each enemy in the blast, so there's no friendly fire option. It's not each creature in the blast, it's each enemy. So it's, attack, charisma versus fortitude, hit 1d6 plus charisma thunder damage, and you push the target 1 square. Then there's an effect, you slide each ally in the blast 1 square. So enemies sort of, they get pushed. So push means that it has to be away from the source. So it specifies essentially the direction that you have to use. But when you slide, you can slide the target any direction that you want. So that's sort of the difference there. And there are also some things that require that, like pull a target, and pull would be directly towards the person casting it. So push is directly away, pull is directly towards, and slide can be any direction. And then if you have the Virtue of Valor, so we saw the one where if you had the Virtue of Cunning, how that affected things. With this one for Virtue of Valor, it says the number of squares you push the target and slide the allies equals your con modifier. So you can be a bit more powerful with it, with that ability. So again, really, really cool stuff. And as you can see, again, it continues the theme of all of your abilities pretty much being able to deal some sort of damage in combat, but also have a secondary effect that can either improve your allies' abilities or can hinder your enemies. So really cool stuff so far. And then the last thing we're going to take a look at here are the level 1 daily spells. So daily Encounter powers, you could take, I think it's like a 5 or 10 minute rest at the end of combat, and then you gain the ability to basically recharge all of your spent encounter abilities. 5th edition has a similar mechanic. They just increase the length of a short rest, meaning that you're not going to use those abilities that you regain after a short or long rest as often in 5e as you could in 4th edition, where it's kind of, intended that you'll have access to the encounter powers every single encounter. Again, you just take a short rest to get those back. With daily, these are typically much more powerful than your encounter abilities, but you have to complete a long rest, which I think in 4th edition is 6 hours, but you have to complete a long rest in order to regain them. So let's take a look at these ones here. We've got Echoes of the Guardian, so this is a first level bard ability. Let's just zoom in a little bit more here. There we go. All right, so it says, you recite a verse from the saga of a great warrior, confounding your enemy so that one of your companions can more easily protect the others. And also daily abilities tend to have a lot more complexity to them as well. So this is, again, daily. It's an arcane weapon. It's a standard action, and it requires a melee weapon. You target one creature, and it is charisma versus armor class. On a hit, you deal 2 weapon dice plus your charisma modifier to damage, and until the end of your next turn, the target is marked by an ally within 5 squares of you. So again, you have the ability to mark the enemy on behalf of another player character, imposing an attack penalty on the enemy unless they include the person who marked them in their attack. Now, another thing about a lot of daily abilities is that if they're damage dealing, even if they miss, they still deal some damage. So it's kind of the equivalent of like a save for half in 3rd edition or in 5th edition. So with this Echoes of the Guardian, if you miss, you still deal half damage. And then you have the effect which says, until the end of the encounter, once during each of your turns, choose an ally within 5 squares of you. When you hit an enemy until the end of your next turn, that enemy is marked by that ally. So the effects take place regardless of hit or miss. So that's an important thing to know as well. Then we've got Slayer's Song, not to be confused with the band Slayer, although if you're playing a bard, that would be a really cool thing to try to tie into it, and I definitely would. It says, you sing a tune of war that diminishes your foe's defenses with each blow you strike. So, it's a daily arcane weapon ability. It's a standard action requiring a melee weapon, 1 target, attack, charisma versus armor class. If you hit 2 weapon dice plus charisma damage, and the target grants combat advantage to you and your allies' save ends. And I think combat advantage is I think it's just a +2 bonus to any attack rolls that you make against that target. And when it says a save ends in 4th edition, saving throws in 4e are kind of what you consider to be like flat checks in 5th edition. So you just roll a d20 and there's nothing that you typically add to it, although there are some features that you can get that will modify certain saves. But I think you're basically, if you get a 11 or higher on the d20, then it ends the effect. So it's kind of like a 50-50 chance for it to continue to go on for additional rounds. That's the basic way that it works. Again, some things can modify that flat roll, but typically speaking, you're just rolling a d20 and seeing what the number is on the die. And then if you miss, it's half damage, and the effect says, until the end of the encounter, whenever you hit an enemy, that enemy grants combat advantage to you and your allies until the end of your next turn. So again, effects they go off whether you hit or miss. Then we got Stirring Shout. So you shout of wrath. Your shout of wrath stabs into a foe's mind. Each time your allies hit that foe, they draw strength from its weakness. It's an arcane healing implement ability that deals psychic damage. It's a standard action, a range of 50 feet, targets 1 creature, and it is charisma versus will defense. The effect on it, if it hits, it's 2d6 plus charisma modifier psychic damage, and the effect, until the end of the encounter, whenever an ally hits the target, that ally regains hit points equal to your charisma modifier. So again, really cool stuff. And then we got one last first level ability that we're going to take a look at here, which is the Verse of Triumph. So we had the stirring shout, Slayer song, Echoes of the Guardian. So here we have Verse of Triumph. Your voice crescendos as you sing a victory. Your inspirational words drive allies forward to attack. It is a daily ability that has the Arcane Charm and weapon keywords. Standard action requiring a melee weapon. Target one creature. And the attack is Charisma versus Armor class. If you hit, it's 2 weapon dice plus your Charisma modifier to damage. If you miss, you still deal half damage. And it says until the end of the encounter, you and any ally within 5 squares of you gain a +1 power bonus to damage rolls and saving throws. In addition, whenever you or an ally reduces an enemy to 0 hit points with an attack, you and any ally within 5 squares of the enemy can shift 1 square as a free action. Okay, so that was the Bard's first level abilities, and again, that just gives you a really good idea of how their class abilities are kind of structured. So again, it seems like every ability that they have has a minor secondary effect that can either aid allies or hinder enemies, and some of these, the more powerful abilities, can also be influenced depending on the virtue that you chose, whether it was Cunning or Valor. Even though they have a wide selection of ranged weapons that they can use, most of their weapon abilities are dependent on melee, but it's just a situation where if you've used your daily and your encounter powers, or if you're low in hit points and you still want to be able to contribute and you're out of the out of those features, then you still have the ranged weapons to sort of fall back on. I was trying to see if there were any weapon ones that actually are based off range, but I haven't found any looking through here. But it's still, again, you have a little bit of flexibility with how you want to use weapon attacks, if that's the case, because you still have a ton of abilities that you can utilize that don't rely on weaponry at all. So again, it's always still an option to have there, but it is cool that they have a decent amount of range attacks in case they run out of other stuff that they want to use. All right, so let's just sort of flip through, and again, they've got all kinds of abilities that they gain throughout various levels. I'm not going to go through each and every single one here, but like I said, I just wanted to give you sort of an idea. So again, with 4th edition, the classes were designed to all be effective in combat, and they also have the role that they fill in combat also sort of be a determining factor into how their features are basically determined. So the leader side of things, the Bard has some abilities that temporarily grant hit points or can even full-on heal party members, give them bonuses to hit, things along those lines, maneuver player characters in such a way around the battlefield that it can make it more advantageous for them to actually be able to engage with enemies. And then the controller side of things has abilities that can target multiple enemies at the same time, as well as secondary effects that will hinder them by granting either bonuses for your allies to attack them, or penalties to their defenses, or just some other things that might hinder them. So again, just some really cool stuff that they gave the Bard here. And like I said, there's all kinds of other abilities here. If you want to pause and take a look at some of these in closer detail, you certainly can, but we're going to sort of move on to another aspect that the characters in 4th edition had, and that was Paragon Paths. We're not really going to focus too heavily on them here, but in 4th edition, you had Paragon Paths, which in a lot of cases mimicked the concept of a prestige class from 3rd edition, where with prestige classes, they were mostly revolved around multi-class characters meeting certain prerequisites. And this version of the game, they are sort of designed to be a core aspect of the class. So some of them might more directly mimic a prestige class like Assassin or Arcane Archer or things along those lines, but there's also a lot of unique ones here. This is something that does carry over into 5th edition, where you have things like the Bard Colleges, or things like fighter traditions that they can use, or monastic traditions for monks. So it's something that, again, was actually integrated into 5th edition as well. But in 4E, it's the first time that these sort of more focused prestige class kind of concepts were actually developed into the core class specifically, as opposed to just being something out there that you could, that others could create these multi-class scenarios to try to get. I like this more because, again, Wasn't a huge fan of multiclassing in 3rd or 5th edition, so I like the way that 4th kind of handled things here. With your Paragon Paths, you do have prerequisites. So Student of the 7, for example, it says that you have to be a bard, but you also have to have a multiclass feat. And it says, among many legends told by bards, a few mythic figures appear with some regularity, including the mysterious 7. The 7 are sisters, or sometimes brothers, whose names vary from tale to tale. They're not gods, but they're not mortals either. Sometimes they're exarchs of Corellon or some other good god. Exarchs are basically like chosen champions of the god sort of thing. They get a minor amount of like divine power. They're not quite demigods. They're sort of like the next step down from that. And sometimes they're angels who come from 7 different domains, but most often they're simply the 7. Some tales describe them as patrons of the arts, inventors, or sponsors of dance, poetry, singing, instrumental music, painting, drama, and the like. Other tales describe them as patrons of every mortal activity, or even as sponsors of different power sources. The 7 are never exactly the same. So it says, following the promptings of the 7, your interests accept no limitations. No narrow field of study can contain your wide-ranging curiosity. You excel as an arcane leader, but what's to prevent you from learning a few tricks from a martial defender or a primal controller? No knowledge is off limits and nothing is impossible. By taking multi-class feats and learning powers from a variety of classes, you always have the right tool for the job. In addition, you learn spells that have enormous versatility, ensuring that you can provide help anytime you or an ally needs a bonus in a specific area. You dabble in a little bit of everything and manage to not only improve yourself, but to also make others a little better at what they do best. So this is kind of, closer to like the classic bard, where they're like the jack of all trades kind of concept. So they gain each Paragon Path that you gain starting at 11th level has a daily mastery ability. So this one here says, at the end of an extended rest, you can replace a daily power granted through a multi-class feat with another daily power of the same level or lower from the same class. So again, just that's that versatility, right, when it comes to multi-classing. Versatile action, you also gain at 11th level. So when you spend an action point, action points, I think they just essentially give you like an extra action that you can take. When you spend an action point to take an extra action, you regain the use of an encounter utility power or an encounter attack power that you gained through a multi-class feat that you have used during this encounter. So again, just cool stuff. I didn't really dive into the utility abilities, but they're essentially things that are usually used outside of combat. So they're not like necessarily the same. They won't focus on dealing damage. Let's actually take a look back at a utility ability here. So we got Hunter's Tune here. We'll just take a look at this first one here. It says you shape the flow of sound containing it and creating an area of silence. It's a daily ability. It's ranged within 10 feet. It targets one ally. Until the end of your next turn, the target gains +5 power bonus to stealth checks and doesn't take a penalty to stealth checks for moving more than 2 squares or running. Sustain minor. So sustain is just, it requires a certain action type. So it could be sustain minor or sustain standard. So this is just a sustain minor, so you can't take a minor action in the same round that you sustain the spell, but it says the effect persists if the target is within range, which is within the 50 feet there. So again, that's something that's going to more likely apply out of combat, so they can give you boost to skills, or some of them might even be like healing abilities or things along those lines, but they're typically not something that you would use in a combat situation. So that's what a utility power is. And then they gain a compensatory insight. When you use an attack power granted through a multi-class feat, you gain a bonus to the attack's damage roll equal to your intelligence modifier. And then they gain a few abilities here. I'm not going to read through all of these, but the one I will look at here is just any spell, because that one looks really, really cool. So any spell says, drawing on raw arcane power around you, you shape your spell to the form and purpose you need. As a side effect, you grant momentary protection or a surge of aggressive inspiration to a nearby ally. So it's an encounter power, close burst 5. So again, it's considered to be like a 25-foot radius that you are at the center of. Your square doesn't count, it's to be like 25 feet out from the square that you're occupying. Then it targets one creature in the burst. You make an attack, charisma versus fortitude, reflex, or will. And then if it hits, it is 3d8 charisma plus your charisma modifier to damage. And it says, effect until the end of your next turn, one ally in the burst gains a +2 bonus to all defenses or a +1 bonus to attack rolls. So again, it's sort of like that multi-purpose one. You determine which defense that you go after. You choose it as you're casting the spell. It does sort of just the flat damage, so it's not typed. So resistances would be difficult to overcome there. And you can choose to either increase your allies' defenses or give them a bonus to attack roll. So again, really, really cool stuff. And there are several of these Paragon Paths. I'm just going to show them here. And again, if you want to pause the video and read the description, you certainly can. But this was the one that I actually kind of liked the most because it takes advantage of the multi-class system in 4th edition, which I like a lot more than the 3rd edition or 5th edition way that it was handled. So here we have the Summer Rhymer. So this is, you have to be a bard as well as have the Virtue of Cunning class feature. Voice of Thunder, you just need to be a bard. And then you've got War Chanter, where you have to be a bard and have the Virtue of Valor class feature. And again, if you want to see what those do, you can pause the video and read through their abilities. So there you go. So that is the 4th edition Bard. And like I said, there was kind of a lot to cover with 4th edition and the 4th edition Bard in this video. Just taking a look at the recording time here, we are at about an hour, and that's focusing on just a single edition of the game. So that's why I decided not to include 5th edition in this one. I wanted to be able to take my time and describe and go over some of the abilities so you can kind of see the types of things that the Bard could do in 4th edition. And overall, the 4th edition Bard, this was the first edition of D&D where I took the Bard pretty seriously and really genuinely wanted to try playing one if I ever had the chance to play as a player. Like, that would be the class that I would choose if I ever was invited to a 4th edition D&D game. It's also interesting that with the exception of the first 4th edition game I ran, which focused on the D&D Essentials line, which did not feature the Bard by default, and just focused on the 4 main classes that you would have like in D&D Basic, the Fighter, the Cleric, the Wizard, and the Rogue. With the exception of that one group, that one game, every other 4th edition game I ever ran or started, somebody played a Bard, and that's something that just never happened. I never had anyone play a Bard in 3rd edition D&D or during my time running 2nd edition D&D, but with 4th edition, a lot of times people would look through the different classes and they would look at the Bard and they really liked what they saw. I don't think it's a stretch to say that the 4th edition really improved the Bard beyond what I think a lot of people were really expecting. And I would say that 4th edition did the Bard class justice. I mean, no, it didn't appear in the first player's handbook, but the fact of the matter is that when we did get the Bard, it was actually pretty awesome. And that's something that we were never really able to say about the Bard class before. The closest we could really get was with Pathfinder 1st edition, because the Bard did have a few really cool abilities, such as Dirge of Doom and Song of Slaying. Actually, that might be the wrong name, but I think that's taken from this book. But you had like so many better Bard abilities, but at the same time, the Pathfinder 1st edition Bard was still kind of one of the weaker classes overall in the game. It was better than it had ever been, but it still wasn't super great. The 4th edition Bard was the first time, like I said, that the Bard actually felt like a really awesome class to read through and for people to choose to play pretty regularly, at least in my groups. So I was really happy with that. And truthfully, beyond just the 1st edition AD&D Bard being so unique as far as old school D&D classes were concerned, you know, being one of the driving forces behind me wanting to do this video series, the 4th edition Bard is the second biggest reason that I wanted to do a Through the Ages look at the Bard class, because it just, you know, improved so much from 3rd edition to 4th. And it's one of those things where 4th edition, the Bard really benefited from the fact that classes were designed around the combat system, and that each of the classes was meant to be good at what they do in combat. It's no longer a situation where once you cast all your buff spells on the party, you're just a crappier version of a fighter, or you're a crappier version of a wizard. In 4th edition, the Bard has a ton of abilities. I will say the only thing that I kind of wish they would have taken more advantage of was having more abilities that are weapon dependent actually be usable with ranged weapons. But that being said, you know, it is what it is, and the Bard still has so many spells or powers that would be similar to spells that they don't really need to rely on physical weaponry very much. It's the first time that a caster Bard is really viable, and you know, I have to say it's something that I really appreciated in this version of the game. And there's still, like I said, tons of stuff that you can do role-playing wise. The fact that they have that ability where you can give them a bonus on their diplomacy checks is really cool. But you know, you can still have the player give their speech, right? And they can role-play that stuff out. There's still the ability to role-play in 4th edition is as strong as it ever was. It's just up to the specific groups. It's just that the classes and the abilities of the classes are designed with a specific role in combat in mind, and they excel at what they're meant to do. And the Bard is among them. It's the most improved class, I can honestly say, from 3rd edition to 4th edition. Of all of the core classes from the 3rd edition Player's Handbook, the Bard is the one that I would say improved the most from 3rd to 4th. And it's actually one of my favorite 4th edition classes, which I never thought I would find myself saying about the Bard. If you asked me back in 2000 or 2005, you know, or anywhere up till 2008 or really 2010, when I started really getting into 4th edition, if I ever thought I would find myself saying that the Bard is one of my favorite classes, I would have laughed, because the Bard just really was, like I said, was the butt of the joke. It was the jack of all trades, master of none. Here they can do all kinds of great things. They don't overshadow any of the other classes, but they're just good at what they do, and they can contribute on the regular in a combat scenario. And Dungeons and Dragons as a property has always been very heavily based around combat. So I like the fact that the Bard class now has more than 4 abilities in their entire repertoire that they can do that will deal damage beyond just swinging a weapon for a regular, just standard attack. So there we go. That is the 4th edition Bard, and like I said, there was a lot to cover in this video, mainly because a lot of people didn't really get into 4th edition, or it's kind of the most unique amongst the rule sets. So there were definitely some things that I wanted to try to explain as best as I could beforehand to make the context of the class abilities for the Bard make a little bit more sense. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, because this is my favorite one that I've done in this series to date. Like I said, the 4th edition Bard is the second biggest reason that I wanted to make this video series in the first place. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Anyway, now that I can take a breath, let me know in the comments below, did any of you, either as a player, as a group, as like a player character in a group of other PCs, or as a dungeon master, did you ever get to play a Bard in your game, or have somebody in your group that did? Let me know if you did, sort of some cool stories or anecdotes about the way that the Bard class or the Bard character performed, or the things that they did. Just share your Bard 4th edition memories or stories with me if you feel up to it in the comments below. I do appreciate it. Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you come back for part 4 when we take a look at D&D 5th edition and how the Bard has changed, or how the Bard in 5th edition, maybe how it benefited from the 4th edition Bard more than it did the 3rd edition Bard. We'll see. But yeah, that'll be the next video in the series. Then the final video in the main series will feature the 2nd edition Pathfinder Bard, and I will be doing a companion video to discuss some of the variant class features that some of the 3rd edition books, as well as some of the Pathfinder 1st edition books, have given to the Bard class. And finally, that video will also contain a little bit of a discussion on a Starfinder character class that is not a Bard, but it is basically the Starfinder version of a bard. So yeah, like I said, thank you guys very much. I really appreciate it, and I will see you all next time. Take care.